Vermont is called the Green Mountain State for obvious reasons. Most of the time, you're either on a mountain or looking at a mountain, softly covered with green trees. But for most people, the magic of Vermont is when the mountains turn from green to red and gold. The locals call the season peak, and it has some secrets all its own. Part of the joy of traveling here is the constant delight in the play of the landscape. In some places, you wind through steep mountain ravines and then come out into lovely rolling valleys. The trick to wandering through the Green Mountains is to stop a lot and find the details of the colors as well as the vistas. In late summer and autumn, it's worth the effort to get up early and get on the road up into the hills. The valleys tend to fill up with morning fogs, and you can think that you're in for a bad day. But up on the hills, you can look down on the fogs. There's a soft magic to these morning landscapes. Of course, some days the fogs set in permanently and you can't get above them. This often means that foliage season is seen under gray skies rather than blue. But don't let that worry you. The colors attain an even richer glow under the soft light. Since leaf peeping is one of Vermont's most advertised activities, it's also worth remembering that in most years, the fall colors happen at different places at different times. Peak colors move from north to south, starting in the latter part of September up in the Northeast Kingdom, and moving to the southern part of the state by Columbus Day. Up in the gaps, crossing the mountains, you'll find the colors earlier than down below. And the tops of the hills can look pretty bare by the time the valleys turn. Once the leaves have reached their peak, they don't tend to hang around. So be prepared to follow the colors. And finally, the small side roads and dirt lanes are often the best way to discover the real Vermont. Slow down, dally and explore at a gentle pace. You'll be surprised at what you find. Other than drawing some rather arbitrary lines on a map, there's no clear dividing line that defines central Vermont. But the state includes it in its tourist packages, so they must know. Central Vermont is where you find all of the elements for which the state is famous. It has the mountains and beautiful vistas, and the classic towns and covered bridges. To get the flavor of central Vermont, you should discover it through its small towns and quiet sense of history. The Coolidge birthplace at Plymouth Notch is a good place to start. Silent Cal Coolidge was president when America enjoyed the Roaring '20s. His taciturn manner exemplified Vermont to the country. Now the state lovingly preserves his memory here at Plymouth Notch. William Jenney is the site administrator.
The Plymouth Notch Historic District includes not only the birthplace of Calvin Coolidge, but the birthplaces of his parents, his grandparents, all his friends and neighbors. And so it is essentially the town as it was in Coolidge's day. So people come here not only to see the Presidential Association, but to see what rural Vermont used to be like. He was incidentally the only president to be born on the 4th of July. The birthplace is exactly as it was at that time. We're very fortunate in having all original furnishings in there. It is attached to the back part of the general store, which was operated by the president's father, Colonel John Coolidge. When Calvin Coolidge was 4 years old, they moved across the street to a larger structure, which is called the Coolidge homestead. And so that is the building where he was sworn in as president on August 3rd, 1923, by his father. The town is largely owned and operated now by the State of Vermont Division for Historic Preservation. We're quite fortunate with the staff that we have here. Some of them knew Calvin Coolidge themselves.
Moxie was Calvin Coolidge's favorite drink, and at the night he was sworn into office, he came over here at the store to celebrate with some of the friends, and he got his bottle of Moxie parked down a nickel, and he expected the rest of them to do the same.
A little up from Plymouth Notch is the quintessential Vermont town of Woodstock. A while ago, the Rockefellers put a lot of money into the town to help with its preservation, and it shows. But Woodstock has always been a beautiful town, and even at the time of the Civil War, it was said that the residents of Woodstock have less need to wonder about the nature of heaven, since they have experienced a little of it already. Early on, it was a place for gentlemen farmers who worked a vision of enlightened agriculture. The Billings Farm Museum just out of town preserves that vision in a still working 19th century farm. Here on special days you can find giant pumpkins and Victorian games for the children. Woodstock is also quite proud of its covered bridge in the center of town, which is actually one of the newest in the state. Finding these covered bridges is a favorite sport for Vermont travelers, and bridge hunters might want to take a drive up Route 110 north of Woodstock. The road winds along the first branch of the White River, and if you're willing to check your map pretty close, you'll find that there are a lot of covered bridges just off the road. This valley aside, nowhere in New England are there more covered bridges than here in Vermont. But these bridges were not built for the romantic appeal, although one might admit that the old Yankees did seem to have an eye for their proper placement. No, these bridges were built to last. Most of them were a major capital investment for the farmer on the other side of the river. He didn't have the time or the inclination to go fixing the bridge very often. And a roof on a bridge acts somewhat like the roof on a house, making sure that whatever is under it will last a lot longer. Thrift in all things was a hallmark of the Vermonter. The larger bridges were built as a major capital improvement by the towns. In that case, the town fathers wanted to make sure that the bridges were also protected from unseemly behavior inside. Besides these bridges, along the White River and a little to the east along Route 25, you can find some of the prettiest towns anywhere. Royalton has a classic green and bandstand. And there's Chelsea, with its double green and sense of appropriate pace. East Corinth usually shows up in any book of Vermont pictures. And this classic view of Waits River is usually seen in state promotions, depending on the season. But by mid-September, everybody in the area will probably be found in the town of Tunbridge when it's time for the World's Fair. Euclid Farnham is the fair's president.
Well, back in the very early days of the fair, we used to have political people come as guest speakers, and we had a local lieutenant governor came, and wanting to get local votes, he declared that it was a little World's Fair. So the next year they dropped the little, and it became the World's Fair, and it's been that way now for more than 100 years. Here at the Tunbridge Fair, we have almost everything going on, everything from competition in cattle, sheep, swine, poultry, garden produce. And then, of course, we have all kinds of pulling events, pony pulling, ox pulling, horse pulling. We have a marvelous antique cabin museum full of craftspeople who are on duty all the time, doing whatever their craft is. We have horse racing on 3 days, which is a real traditional event here in Tunbridge. It's been with us for 119 years, if you believe. In the pulling competitions, we have both a distance event, which is held in front of our grandstand, and they have a certain amount of weight on the sled. The vehicle they pull is called sled. And they have a certain amount of time to pull that.
Oh, the oxen was here long before the horses were. Yeah. Oh, my father had oxen. Yeah, I've got oxen about 30 years now, and it's an old traditional sport.
When you watch the pull, you'll see the difference between oxen and horses. Oxen are very placid, quiet creatures. Generally don't get nerved up at all, but the horses are quite different. When they know and they sense when the time to pull is coming, and they start getting nervous, and you can really see that in their reactions, as well as their driver's reaction, by the way.
Up on the hill here, we're the different part of the fair, and a part that very few fairs have. We call it Antique Hill. So these engines you see here in the 1920s and 30s, or even back to 1900, were the common source of power to run that thrashing machine over there. This one right here, a little 2.5 eel valve, we took right off in the milking machine here in Tunbridge.